Earlier this year, the state of Georgia passed an election reform measure. Democrats around the nation rallied to boycott Georgia. Major League Baseball moved its all-star game after Stacey Abrams first called for a boycott and then said she didn't. Democratic activists sought to punish the state. The President of the United States and the Justice Department said they would investigate the state of Georgia. They wanted to punish the state of Georgia for passing an election reform measure. During the election last year, Georgia and many other states used election drop boxes where people could drop off their absentee ballots. Now, the law is that you can put an absentee ballot in a mailbox, even without a stamp. The post office is going to deliver it. But Democrats made drop boxes a big thing. The drop boxes were part of the Trump administration's suggestions for handling an election during a pandemic. The Department of Homeland Security put out the guidelines. The various state governors had issued executive orders to comply with federal rules and guidance for handling the election. The drop boxes were one, so states did drop boxes. When the gubernatorial emergency orders expired, the drop boxes would go away. There will be no drop boxes in Georgia for the coming election, except in its election reform package, the state of Georgia decided to legalize drop boxes. The drop boxes have to be placed at boards of election. They have to be available for use 9 to 5 weekdays. They have to be emptied at the end of each day, and they have to be monitored. And 2 people have to empty them so that no one person could potentially engage in hanky-panky with the ballots. The state also insisted on 19 days of early voting, more than most states out there, actually. There's got to be multiple Saturdays, and there's got to be one optional Sunday for voting. The state of Georgia also required photo ID for absentee ballots. In the past, absentee ballots in Georgia were examined based on people's signatures on their voter registration card and their absentee ballot, and they had to match. The state expanded it to driver's license because some people registered to vote 30, 40 years ago, and their signatures changed over time, so the option was you could go with their most recent driver's license signature. And that's not really good. People change their signatures. Some people I know willfully made their signatures not match at all, and their ballots were accepted. So the new rule is that you've got to have a photo ID. You put in your photo ID number. The state of Georgia gives you a free photo ID, and you put that number on your absentee ballot, and it's got to match, go to your home address, all of that sort of stuff. That's what the state of Georgia did. The state of Georgia was denounced by Democrats across the nation. The state of Georgia was denounced by Stacey Abrams. The state of Georgia was denounced by major corporations. Delta Airlines, among others, denounced the state of Georgia's election reform after Delta had kept its mouth shut or had helped take out some provisions. Delta was pressured and bullied by progressives to do something. Home Depot is being boycotted by progressives for not being vocal enough. Even though they were vocal, they weren't vocal enough. They didn't perform enough against the law. The Democrats have been agitating now for something called the For the People Act in the United States Congress. It would be a massive takeover of federal elections. It would ban gerrymandering. It would require federal funding for candidates for office, including people like Marjorie Taylor Greene down in Georgia. It would do a lot of things, including curtailing the number of days. It would give the state of Georgia less early voting days than the state of Georgia currently has. Now, here's a fact that has not gotten any mention. Georgia, prior to its election reform law, was on the Institute for Free Elections, ranked 49th, the 49th toughest state to vote in on the cost of voting index. After Georgia's election reform law was passed, it went to 25th. It's the largest shift of any state in the cost of voting index. So in other words, according to the cost of voting index, Georgia is now an easier state to vote in than it was, but you wouldn't know that from the press. I focus on Georgia, not because I live there. There's not a bias in me focusing on it. It's the one that got so much attention. It's the one that caused Major League Baseball to pack up a game and move it somewhere else. It's the one that called for the boycotts. It's the one that agitated the left. Well, Joe Manchin has said he won't support the For the People Act. Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, has killed the For the People Act. And today, Joe Manchin offered a compromise proposal Joe Manchin offered a compromise proposal, and I want to play for you audio from Stacey Abrams. This is Stacey Abrams on CNN this morning talking about Joe Manchin's compromise.
That a compromise you could support?
Absolutely. What Senator Manchin is putting forward are some basic building blocks that we need to ensure that democracy is accessible no matter your geography. And those provisions that he is setting forth are strong ones that will create a level playing field, will create standards that do not vary from state to state, and I think will ensure that every American has improved access to the right to vote despite the onslaught of state legislation seeking to restrict access to the right to vote.
This is very notable. She's supporting Joe Manchin's compromise because do you know what Joe Manchin's compromise is? Joe Manchin has taken Georgia's election law that Stacey Abrams opposed and drafted it as federal legislation. I'm not making that up. Joe Manchin's law would require photo ID for voting, including absentee ballots, like Georgia. Joe Manchin's law would require 19 days of early voting, just like Georgia. Joe Manchin would restrict drop boxes to boards of elections between the hours of 9 to 5, just like Georgia. Joe Manchin's compromise that Stacey Abrams says she supports is Georgia's voting law that Stacey Abrams condemned and urged boycotts to. But because Joe Manchin's doing it in the Senate, she's okay with it. Joe Manchin's law does do a couple of things more expansive than Georgia's law. One of them would require independent, nonpartisan commissions for gerrymandering. Now, here's the rub. It's still not going to pass. Joe Manchin's not going to be able to peel 10 Republicans away from Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell doesn't want it to pass because of the gerrymandering commission, among other things. So it's still not going to pass. Manchin's providing a compromise where he could get some Republicans, but the Republicans are going to kill it. And Joe Manchin's already said he's not going to get rid of the filibuster. He's not even going to compromise on reform of the filibuster. But we get a lesson in hypocrisy here, don't we? Joe Manchin has taken Georgia's law, the law the left excoriated, and he's turned it into federal law. And in so doing, revealing the hypocrites. The Manchin, I'm reading now from Nate Cohen. Nate Cohen writes at the New York Times, the Manchin compromise has a very limited effect on Georgia's laws. That's partly because neither the Manchin proposal directly tackled the election subversion claims that were most significant but overshadowed the new Georgia law, but the Manchin plan resembles the Georgia system in more fundamental ways. Early voting, ID requirements, no excuse absentee balloting, drop box regulations. Perhaps that's because Georgia's voting law has long been a lot closer to the national average than the critics acknowledge. That's a writer for the New York Times, their political guy at the New York Times, admitting that the media outrage over Georgia's law was overhyped. They do it time and time again in the media. They pick up the Democratic narrative and they run it as gospel truth. And then the reality is that it's not actually true. It's not actually real. It's not actually a statement of fact. It's a narrative prepackaged by Democrats, made easily digestible by a dumb press that then pushes it out, regurgitates it as stenographers for the progressive activists. What Georgia did wasn't bad. What Georgia did was fairly mainstream. What Georgia did is now being embraced in many ways by Joe Manchin, and Stacey Abrams is now embracing those very things she condemned. Photo ID for balloting, Georgia's time frame for early voting, all of those things. Maybe, perhaps, the outrage was partisan all along. Now, this federal law is still not going to pass. The filibuster is still going to remain. But he's made a reasonable compromise. But what Joe Manchin has done more than anything else is he's exposed the rank hypocrisy and flat-out lying in both the press and among a lot of Democrats, including Stacey Abrams. And that we can all thank him.